Welcome back to another episode of 6 Degrees of Associations. I'm your host, Lucas McCann. With me today, Sam Evans, Certification Director at IAAP. Welcome to the show, Sam.
Thanks so much, Lucas. I'm so glad to join you today.
My pleasure. Well, those that are watching can see all of the long list of credentials of Sam behind her name. And I don't know that we'll get into all of those, but I would like to hear, Sam, a little bit more about, your current role, and then we can back into, how you found associations originally.
So I am currently working for the International Association of Accessibility Professionals. And so it is a trade membership combination group. So we have both organizational and individual members, and they all work in the accessibility profession. So all of our members work in digital, physical space, policy engagement, for removing barriers for people with disabilities to be able to live, learn, work, and play in their community of choice. So my members do really amazing work, and I happen to manage, develop, and maintain the certifications that our organization offers. And I've been in that role for 8 years now, and 6 years full time. And before that, I originally was going to be this small project that was going to be project managing as part of my role at another organization, and has grown a good bit. So we were one certification, 35 people 8 years ago, and now I'm at about 7,000 people with certifications in about 110 countries around the world, and 5 full different certification programs. So
Wow. Talk about growth. That's been a fun ride, having a moment, and I hope that continues.
we do too. There's plenty of need and lots of demand. So we hope it continues to grow.
Well, I know some of the audience is thinking, what is accessibility? And I do want to get into that, and let's come back to that in a moment. Tell us a little bit of history. How did you get into associations? What keeps you in this crazy world?
My parents both worked in places that touch associations. So my mother was a director of education for a realtors association, and my stepfather was a general manager and a sales and marketing director for hotels. So I came up with parents who worked on, on associations and events. So I didn't fall into it accidentally. When I actually came out of grad school, one of the first jobs I happened to hear about was an association that was looking to go from volunteer management to staff led, and they were looking for their first chief staff officer. And I thought, this would be great. And my MBA professors were like, you're never going to make any money. And I was like, I kind of like mission purpose things. And so, with very few exceptions, with one boutique marketing agency I worked for, I've always worked in associations and nonprofits. So, so I started off as taking over first as a first staff officer for an organization, and then came to be the first staff member and CEO for another. And then I had an association management company where I did management for smaller groups that needed fractional staff. And spent a little bit of time when the economy took a dip. Went to work in higher education and K-12 education, both for, again, marketing, community build, those sorts of things, and happened to come back into higher ed, and that came to accessibility and led its way to where I am now. So
one of the things for me, the joys of doing this show in general has been listening to all of the passion and mission driven folks, right? That there is a real passion in this industry for those that follow mission. And you're obviously one of those folks. And is there a specific passion around accessibility specifically? Did you seek this role out? Did it seek you out? How did that come to be?
I think it was kind of kismet or serendipity or whatever you want to call happenstance. For when I came back from college, my roommate was losing her vision, and so she needed somebody with eyes and a car to help. My meeting planner at my first association job uses a wheelchair, so the perspective there was very different about ensuring physical accessibility for our attendees from meeting planning perspective. I'm deaf and hard of hearing. I have a math disability. So it's been part of life across the board. One of the charitables that I managed for a number of years was a dementia association. And so I learned a lot about cognitive disabilities and traumatic brain injuries. And so given my passion for mission-driven organizations, the first accessibility job I took, I was so excited because they were delivering services for people with disabilities and making things equitable. And I thought, wow, that is a mission I can really support. I can tell that story. I can make those accounts successful. I can market that. And that's where this project management for this association for IAAP came in. And
Mhm.
so it's been a really happy place for my heart and soul. And I'm able to tell people we do good work for good people for good reasons every day. It makes it easy to go to work. So I get to be a practitioner and a staff member. So I live and work in the community we serve.
Yeah, that's amazing. I mean, it's really touched you, and now you're getting a chance to get back and contribute in this role, and call it work, if we if we could. Well, let's jump into accessibility. For those in the audience that aren't familiar with it or in different roles within associations, or maybe just venturing into accessibility as a field of study, tell us a little bit more about what that means specifically and within associations.
Sure. So as you go through the CAE domains, if you're, if you hold your CAE and you've done your study or you're preparing for, there's 10 domains of all of our business work that we do in association management. And there's only one that might not have accessibility built in, but it kind of has to by default. But accessibility actually touches all of our 10 domains in CAE work. So in association management, accessibility means ensuring that there's equitable access for people with disabilities to engage just like someone who's not yet disabled. So that means removing barriers, and that means making business decisions and service delivery and policy and planning to be disability inclusive. So that's going to be not just the physical environment. Most of us know disability inclusion about accessibility for physical spaces, buildings and places that our bodies take up, and how we do in the physical built environment. And that's most of what the ADA, most people are familiar with ADA and Section 508, for many years was focused only on the built environment. But about 25, 30 years ago, when the digital world picked up, an organization started establishing standards for digital accessibility. So that means that everything we use in digital spaces, the products, the tools, the services, being accessible, equitable accessibility, meaning there's not a barrier, there's not a level between the people with disabilities and the product or service.
Mhm.
And so um, if you want to go way back, there was a practice for a while when websites first came out to have the pretty picture version and then the plain black and white text version.
Yeah.
And the airline industry got into some trouble for that, which is probably the first example of, oh, I'll just make a different version for disabled people. And so the concept, then ADA did some harmonized refresh in 2016, 2017 that separate, but separate is not equal. And so in the digital space, that comes together too. So that means first understanding disabilities and understanding how disabled people face barriers so that then we can understand how to make sure our products and services and our content and our tools are usable in an equitable fashion. That's the short, that's the short version of what accessibility means.
Yeah. I think for maybe most folks, they do think about, sort of ADA, they think of the physical. Give us some other examples of maybe lesser known, but lesser acknowledged sort of disabilities that come up in this sort of space.
So the things people think about most is, oh, I see someone who uses a wheelchair, not in a wheelchair. They may physically sit in a wheelchair, but they use a wheelchair, or they may use, a scooter, or perhaps somebody is blind and uses like a white cane or has a guide dog
Mhm.
or is low vision and has darker glasses, or people who are deaf and hard of hearing who may be deaf and use sign language, or maybe hard of hearing and have a hearing aid, or and need to use captions. We need to consider people who have reading and learning disabilities. So I'm sure lots of people know someone who has dyslexia, or in childhood education, someone has a support system for reading disabilities or learning disabilities, cognitive disabilities. But considerations about neurodiversity is something people are learning about now.
Hmm.
And that has to do with communication styles and methods and tools and spaces in our environments. Mental health is a disability to be considered. And so we need to be expanding our thoughts about what being disabled means and how that impacts people's ability to engage, both as staff on the staff side of things and our members on the outside and the public at large that many of our associations serve.
Yeah. Well, what about some practical example? Who does this well? I know we talked pre-show, the meeting planners and events folks maybe have a bigger impact, but you also mentioned staff. Like, can you give us some examples? Who's doing this well? And you don't have to name them by name if you don't, but what are some of the practices and things specifically that they're thinking about implementing either programmatically or, by event?
So I think associations, whether that's on their member services side and their products and delivery, if they have a DEI, DEIA, DEIB, whatever your alphabet soup is about inclusion,
Mhm.
is that they first have a commitment to understanding people with disabilities and what those disabilities need and how people with disabilities need to be provided equal access first. That's the magic solution. That's where it starts, when it's done well, that's usually the key. People may have picked up some things and went, "Oh, I'm going to do this," and that may also be a solution. But the key to understanding anything with people is first understanding their needs and then understanding how to remove barriers that exist. So, what's really great is when organizations undertake on. I'll start on like meeting planning. We can talk about physical accessibility, but
Mhm.
all of our work is digital, 24/7. We all live, work, breathe, play in digital spaces.
We're digital
So
now.
understanding, yeah. So in digital accessibility, that means everything we touch. So when we first start to understand how we can do better in digital communications is probably the easiest thing for people to do. They can make sure that they have, if we all like images, pictures, social media is full of images. If we use alternative text, which is a short description of what's in the picture,
Mhm.
that allows people who use a variety of technology to not get lost if they can't see the picture, if they're in bright sun, or if they have a low bandwidth or their computer's going slow, they can still get the context and the content. That's kind of an easy thing to do, but we should do it in documents, we should do it in social media. We so that's an easy thing to do. Understanding how important structures are. If most of us all learned how to use an Office suite of tools to word processing, and we all know what those headings are. But if we don't understand that headings become a navigation tool for people who use assistive technologies, it's not about the orange swirly font that you choose. You choose heading one because that's the first, and then heading two because that's the next layer. And if you use them right, you can make a table of contents automatically.
Mhm.
So if we start to learn how to use our tools best, we're also going to deliver more accessible products on communications. When we get into meetings and events, that context matters too. Using plain language helps everyone. It's
Mhm.
nobody except in higher academia probably should be using, I want to say as many words as I can to look smarter. So the simpler we put it, the better it is, the more understandable things are. Um, but when we talk about accessibility, the best thing we can do is show that we're doing the work. So trying to understand that fonts don't solve for dyslexia because dyslexia is a processing disability. So if you see organizations that have been sold a product that says, we have a font for dyslexics, well, that's super, except it doesn't really apply. It might make things more readable for some people, but dyslexia is not based in text. It's not a visual take-in of information. It's a processing disability that has more to do with how we associate sounds with letters. So understanding disabilities first helps people sort through what's in the market on things. Understanding how disabled people use computers. You may have voice activated things at home that you're used to using because, hey, that's Alexa, that's Google,
Right.
those are all originally designed for disabled people who either don't use a mouse or blind or have other disabilities. So there's a lot of things in our world that are based in disability resources, but we know how to use those because we've learned those skills. We need to learn the same skills in digital spaces, and particular when we buy products and services, our vendors, our vendor partners. Um, Understanding what it means to be digitally accessible is a really good question to ask when you're procuring a product or a service, but also knowing how to sort out what that means. You don't have to be a technical genius to understand. But so there's a standard, there's 78 criteria, and either companies support or don't support or partially. And you can, if you want to learn more about that, I'm happy to give you a 5-minute, run through. But understanding digital accessibility and what it is and what it's not is a really good way to start affecting change. So if you have the opportunity in your procurement process to only do business with vendors who are digitally accessible, you'll serve your members better, you'll serve your public better, you'll be at less risk, you'll meet the European Canadian standards, you'll meet Title II of 508. So it's all good stuff, but we have to make a intentional choice to change or use the power of the purse to say, vendor X, I love your product, but we have a commitment to disability inclusion, and that means I'm only going to purchase products that are accessible. Come back to me when you make that change and we can reconsider. But for right now, I'm going to maintain that commitment. That's a big challenge and it can feel kind of scary, but associations have a power of a purse that's immense. So, so let's shift over to events. So meetings and events. So the things that we can do most readily for events is be clear about what disability considerations you've already made so that you belonging, welcoming. Disabled people often have to make a case. I don't know if I'm welcome. I don't know if I'm going to be allowed. I don't know if they're going to provide the access I need. I'm going to get ready to make the case. I've got to do the work. I've got to provide the proof. None of that is about community or welcoming. So if we are clear about all the things we've already provided, people will be like, wow, they've already thought about me. Hey, this event's for me. So be clear about what you've already included and show that you've already done the work, and then tell people what you can provide if it's not something that's in your list, and to have a list of, who can they talk to make an ask if something's not listed, but having those relationships with vendors, with suppliers, with partners, planning your meeting in advance. The time to find out that you haven't put screens up to display captions is not 3 weeks before your annual conference. It has to happen back at planning. But again, that's part of understanding people is it impacts all those 10 domains. It impacts everything in your budget at meetings and events. So plan in advance and then, but understanding. So one of the things at meetings and events that's the biggest challenge is people not knowing if you've made the plans to be accessible. So if you show it, tell it, have an accessibility page, that's great. You'll list what you've included. But you also understand that what you're providing actually meets the needs of the people. So having a quiet room is super. Having a prayer room is amazing. Having nursing space is brilliant. Saying that we can provide our program and any of the slides in advance for people who are neurodiverse, who are blind and low vision, people have, so those kinds of things really show you've made the effort. If you move into physical space, ideally you didn't sign a contract at a facility in a city and a conference that doesn't have physical accessibility, but you can't trust, not that you can't trust, but ADA compliance for facilities and spaces happens when a building is created and only after a massive renovation. So you have to know the questions to ask your conference service manager, and they may look a little frightened when you ask those questions, but it's kind of up to ask those questions in order to prompt our partners to help meet those needs. But if we consider physical accessibility is probably the easiest one because cities and facilities and locations ideally you're trying to make sure that they're visitable, travelable, appealing spaces and have federal regulations around that. But when we talk about meeting engagement, one of the biggest challenges that I see right now is that people don't understand how deaf and hard of hearing people use captions. So for like right now, I use captions and they are displaying on my screen just under my camera. And alongside so that I can both watch your face, Lucas, and read your lips and see it all together. But captions, in order to be usable, have to be displayed right next to the event, right next to the content. So that really means at in-person events, they need to be on a screen displayed next to the panel. What happens if not is my kind of nuance, I call it the bobblehead effect, is that, hey, you were going to stream captions, you can read them on your phone. So what happens then is that Sam spends her conference time with her peers and colleagues
And
looking
everybody
down
else
at your
looks at the top
phone,
of Sam's head, right?
and I don't get to see what's displayed. I don't get to see the people. I don't get to see the content.
Mhm.
I have to choose. It's a forced choice. Either I can read the content, which means I didn't really need to go to the conference, or I can look at the conference and not hear anything and not take any information in. So understanding how deaf and hard of people use captions and why captions have to be displayed next to things seems to be a big missed point these days, because there are some vendors out there like, we have AI captions and you stream them to your phone and get them in lots of languages, which is great, except that it doesn't really make it usable with the content, the event, the engagement. And so that becomes an unequitable
Yeah.
experience. And if you don't know how to ask that question of a vendor, and nobody is saying, hey, which disabled people did I meet with to learn about their needs, it gets missed. It's not for anybody wanting to do anything not inclusive, but they didn't start with understanding the people and the disability and how people use things. So um, people are getting far better about slides that are inclusive, presentation skills that are inclusive. Um, but sometimes we're missing things because we're looking at a technology and forgetting about the people.
Yeah, the human aspect. Well, I've if I didn't know already, I can tell now, Sam, that you're extremely knowledgeable and passionate about this. I've never laid a question down and wound somebody up like that in the history of this show. So well done. There, one of the things, and there was so much there, and I'm trying to pick through myself. And one of the things that really stood out to me, though, was, and it seems simple, was just the communication aspect, right? As leaders, right? You learn to communicate, and I think that's a lifelong effort. But just it again, it seems thought having a list of those things that as a meeting planner that you've been thoughtful about, and then providing it to attendees or potential attendees, because I imagine there's some aspect of questioning. If I'm going to the event and I don't know this, am I going to go out of my way to then go find out, one, I'm being inconvenienced on the front end of, I now have to go ask you, are there going to be, how is the content going to be displayed? How is it going to be audibly shared? And by having this list readily available, the respect that extends to those that would want to come to your event, I think is just, I think it's more profound than people give it credit for, to your point.
Yeah, when we were kids, we talked about show and tell. So I
Mm-hmm.
always encourage people, show me your inclusion. Don't just tell me about it, show me, because
Yeah,
that impact will be, people will say, this is the first time I've ever been to a registration page and I know I'm welcome.
absolutely.
It's really simple, but it's a big shift in the way we've done things in the past.
And I think there are a few things. I mean, you were just, as you do, probably rattling them off. Here are the things that you should consider. I mean, if there's a list out there somewhere, Sam, of all of these opportunities to be inclusive as it relates to disabilities and accessibility to event, I'd love to include it at the end of this.
Sure.
But that was fabulous. Where, what are some of the questions, right? And this may be a difficult question to ask, but as you're vetting vendors, what are the types of questions? How do I seek to understand if a vendor is truly providing a product or a service that is accessible, and not getting duped into the, oh, I thought it was, but this turns out I'm actually maybe doing more harm than good.
Yeah, and so a previous ASAE staff member said, we can't all be digital accessibility experts. How would we know? And I said, well, how about I come up with a list of like 20 questions you can ask and some basic responses. And so, and I'm happy to share that too. I've got them as a slide. I'm happy to share it
Great.
as a resource. But um, first, understanding kind of, you have to know a little bit, and nobody needs to be an expert to kind of suss this thing, sort of things out. But um, how do you can ask simple questions like, great, you're digitally accessible. How do can you show me how you prove that? What's your process? Do you meet, here's one of the, do you meet WCAG, WCAG standards? Which version? At what level? And so salespeople may panic. Well, let me get back to you on that. The people thing love to say is, of course we're accessible. You can get to us on the web or
Yeah.
on your phone. And while yes, that does mean you can actually physically get to the product or service, that's not what digital accessibility means. And so That's a big aha moment for lots of vendors too. So don't be surprised if you go to ask, but you need to find out when's the last time they tested and validated their accessibility. There's actually a process to create those. It shouldn't be more than a year old because if soon as somebody deploys a line of code or releases a new version, unless they're a mature organization, it's very likely they may have broken or things have changed. And so how do they provide to you their compliance with standards? If it's a consultant or a person that you're going to work with or an agency or a company, you can ask them questions like how many people in your organization are is your organization disability led? What disability organizations are you connected with and engaged with? What's your favorite type of assistive technology? How do you ensure that blind, deaf, and physically disabled people all have usable? So there's some kind of lighthearted questions. But if they don't know the answers to some of them, when you get into things like for electronic text, who remediates your documents for you? Or do you have an internal team? For captioning, what's your word error rate and your formatting error rate? If they're not actually a captioning company, they're not going to know the answer because they don't actually do captions. They may deliver words on a screen, but
Right.
that's not the same thing. Um, so what's your favorite kind of assistive technology? Where did you get your education and training in accessibility? How does your staff stay up to date on the latest trends in disability inclusion and regulations around the world? And are you in compliance with the European standards? When did you make your change? What kind of changes did you make to meet the 508 changes 8 years ago? So there's some questions you can ask, and salespeople, if they don't know the answer, will say, well, tell us what we need to do. If a vendor ever says, tell us what we need to do, they're probably not actually doing the thing.
Right.
And they shouldn't be coming to you, the customer, who's asking them about their accessibility. So if we think things through a little bit, um, you can find some of those questions out. So asking about, but anything that's related to accessibility and disability services really needs to be rooted in disability rights, civil rights, and disability justice.
I
So
love the fact that the salesperson might be asking you how you get there. Maybe you've sparked some interest and inspiration to better and further their product. But to your point, that sounds like one of those opportunities where you need to be ready to say no.
mhm. Some of our colleagues that do AMS and LMS, lists every year. One of them, I said, "Hey, how come accessibility isn't one of your checklist items?" And they're like, "Because everyone would say no." And I said, "That's information."
That is.
And they're like, so they put it back. Um, and so they were afraid it would make our vendor partners look like they aren't quite there yet. And it's like, that's okay. That's information. There's one or two that are almost there, but a lot of our partners aren't yet. We can change that because we can encourage them to put together a roadmap, tell us where things are in their plan. When do you plan to meet these goals? Those are ways that companies can show you they have a plan. And that is really the way to start on progress over perfection. So,
Yeah. And anybody shying away from the feedback or putting themselves out there as it relates to an accessibility ranking, maybe, if you will, or scoring of that as it relates to an AMS, that should tell you something right there. And why not be afraid to accept the feedback and get better as a product or service? If I come back and on the listing, my AMS is, ranked a 2.1 out of 10 in my accessibility, and this becomes increasingly a factor that people are using to make buying decisions, that would be great information if I was the owner of that organization to say, here's an area of opportunity for me, rather than trying to, shy away from maybe some additional investment in programming.
but the goal is to get a roadmap and a date and which team is responsible. Because
Mm-hmm.
otherwise, of course, we're going to work on that. It's very important to us. There's a really funny video from Valuable 500 a few years ago said, next year, 2025, that's the year of the woman, 2026, it's the year of this. And like, when are you going to get to this? And so companies, if it's not already in a strategic roadmap, it means they haven't started yet. So they don't have to have a hard set deadline, but they need to be able to tell you how and when they plan. and what their plan is. And that's transparency is it can sound really vulnerable for organizations, associations alike,
Yeah.
but that's okay because we have to start, but we have to also be clear that we have a plan and that it's disability led and informed and that we have a plan. That's the starting point.
Yeah. Yeah. And nothing happens in any organization, associations or otherwise, without dates, gates, and a leader for accountability.
Yep.
Well, Sam, how about we switch gears? How about a couple of fun ones? Are you open to that?
Sure. Of
Okay.
course.
Well, what is something come January 1st, you have on your calendar every year? This is going on my calendar first before anything else fills up. You look forward to it every year.
We have my husband and I have a musician that we really, really like, and we try to. I didn't go last year because we were moving, but he does a small concert every year for like 2 days. It's a Friday night show and a Saturday night show, and it's some of these amazing artists, and it's a small, intimate setting, and it's like going to a big full-on rock show, but in a small space, and you kind of get to hang out and have chats, and it's really fun. It's a almost every year kind of a thing. So that's a really fun thing. It's
It's fun.
yeah.
Are you open to sharing the artist, or are you keeping it a secret so that it doesn't blow up into a big rock show?
His name is Neil Morse, Morse, and he has a band called the Neil Morse Band. But he used to be in a band called Spock's Beard, and he has people. He's also in a band called Transatlantic, and also with a band called Flying Colors. But we traveled to Chicago not too long ago for a house concert where he came and played in a friend of ours' living room. So
Fun. Well, I may have just given the answer, so you're gonna have to think of another one. But what is something about Sam that we wouldn't find on your resume or on the internet?
mm, I am old school geek. I like to crochet and garden, and so I my relaxation is crochet. But kind of behind me on my bookshelves here, you can see
Okay.
some. I've got some Jack Skellington and Cruella and some other things. As I have a love and passion and came up in the '80s as a goth girl, so um, I loved all things spooky and goth in the music scene, and a lot of us old goths are still around and hanging out and being friends. So probably not any pictures of old days back then, but multicolored hair and lots of black and funky music and big boots. Yeah.
I'm sometimes thankful there aren't a lot of pictures back from them. For myself personally, not too many. Now there's videos and pictures of everything. I think I'm glad I sort of dodged that generational bullet, maybe. And gardening's great. My father retired a few years ago and couldn't wait to garden. That is his retirement living. He said he's never been bored a day in his life, and because he's got a garden in Texas, you know, it will keep him from traveling. That's how committed he is to the garden at times. So
My grandparents gardened, and it was amazing as a child. My one set of grandparents grew fruits and vegetables, but they had green thumbs and they could tell us what every plant was and they could propagate things and the flowers. It was just astounding. And so I think that's kind of like an old thing that we need to kind of hold on to. There's a lot of magic in it. So
there is, and he takes it to a level that I would say you understand from your grandparents. And all the genus and species named. He thinks about the environment. He thinks about the acidities of the soils, what it's around. I mean, it's next level stuff. But all of his stuff is delicious, and I enjoy the fruits of his labor, literally, every time I get to go visit him. So I enjoy that. Well, Sam, as I do, I have the unfortunate task of wrapping this up, but I'd
of
love to
course.
hear if you have somebody in your network that you think our audience would benefit from hearing from.
Yeah, so two people come to mind off the top of my head, and the first is a colleague who is also a CAE. Her name is Demita Snow, and she is a publications specialist, and she works at the American Society of Civil Engineers. She's brilliant in publishing, but she also is a director of diversity, equity, and inclusion. So she worked in standards, DEI, publications, and she's absolutely brilliant. The second person is an independent, but Joan has been in ASAE and in the meetings industry for a lot of years, Joan Eisenstadt. And she is a hospitality meetings industry consultant, but she works specifically with associations to help us do our best work in meetings and events and activities. But she's also a passionate disability rights person. So those two, I think if I could share their wit, knowledge, and passion, they would make the world a better place for everybody.
Wonderful. Well, thank you for the shout outs. We hope they accept our offer to come on and share their wisdom with our little world. And thank you, Sam, so much for coming on. You are an absolute wealth of knowledge, and thank you for joining us.
And I'll share some resources with you. You asked about those questions and things. I'll share some links with you that you're welcome to share with the audience.
Excellent. I know they'd love to see it.